Hey everyone, we are here live for our final Fair Housing Town Hall in celebration of National Fair Housing Month. This is Mary Beth Gates. I am the Director of Development with Housing Opportunities Made Equal, or HOME, of Virginia. And I am joined today with Heather Crislip, our President and CEO, as well as Alex Guzman, our Enforcement and Litigation Director. Later on, we will also be joined by a guest speaker with the Shenandoah LGBTQ Center. Today's topic is gender identity and sexual orientation protections as it pertains to fair housing. So to kick us off, just like we've been doing in previous weeks, Heather, can you give us a background on Fair Housing Month and why it is so important?
Yeah, so April is Fair Housing Month because it was in April of 1968 that Martin Luther King was assassinated. And it took just 7 days for the federal government and the Congress to pass fair housing protections, which, was remarkable at the time, but also seems, really remarkable in our current context. So housing had been left out as an area of protected, in which you were protected from discrimination in the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which was the large landmark act that protected persons from discrimination in public accommodations, in transportation, and in education, and all other areas of public life. But housing was thought to be just a bit too far. So after Martin Luther King's assassination, he had been focusing on fair housing, and it was called open housing at the time. And it took Congress just 7 days to enact fair housing protections. The Fair Housing Act has grown since then. States can offer their own sets of protections. They have parallel laws to the federal Fair Housing Act. And it is one of those new state protections that we're here to talk about today. And this is a set of adding 2 new protected classes to Virginia's Fair Housing Act, which went into effect on July 1st. And those 2 protections require that you cannot be discriminated against based on your sexual orientation or your gender identity. And these protections had a kind of a long course to get to this point, and they were included in the landmark Virginia Values Act of 2020. HOME had first been working on this issue since the 1990s. The first time it was introduced by Senator Marsh from Richmond in the late 1990s as a proposed protection under the Virginia Fair Housing Act. But it had kind of languished. It had been introduced several times in the intervening decades, but we started working on this issue in earnest in about 2014. Feeling like this was definitely the time in which we could get some protections for folks who've been discriminated against because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. So in 2014, there had been several national studies that demonstrated that this was a problem. But whenever we went to talk to the Virginia General Assembly, they would say, well, there's no evidence that this is a problem. We don't know that people are being discriminated against because of their sexual orientation. So we took a protocol that HUD had developed, a methodology for testing, which I'm sure we'll get into in a moment, where we would send email introductions to landlords, one presenting as a same-sex couple and one presenting as an opposite-sex couple. And we would test how well they were responded to. We did this in the Richmond region in 2014, and then we followed up with Hampton Roads in Northern Virginia samples in 2015. And overall, we found that there was a 44% rate of people being responded to differently. Now, that discrimination is often very, very subtle. So these weren't often, go away, I won't rent to you, but they could be the difference between, yeah, look at our website, there's an application there, and, oh, I'll meet you Tuesday at 5 o'clock to show you the apartment. I mean, it's just a difference in the level of engagement that the landlord would have. But we were able to take that research and finally have a cogent argument when we went to the General Assembly to say, look, this is a problem and you need to do something about it. So we had several years where we were able to get bipartisan support in the Senate, but finally in 2020, we were able to get those protections passed.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Heather. Alex, did you have anything to add at this point?
Yeah, I just wanted to provide a little bit more context to Virginia's own legislative history. So thank you for that, Heather. A lot of this, had been developing outside of just housing. In 2015, we have the landmark Supreme Court decision in Obergefell that recognized same-sex marriage across the country. But despite that, there were still local and state laws that facilitated the discrimination of people based on their sexual orientation, gender identity across the country, right? So even though this one very important right had been established under federal law, there was still just a patchwork of discriminatory laws on the books. So a lot of aside from this sort of legislative protection, a lot of civil rights groups were also attempting to expand the definition of sex or gender protections, which was written into federal civil rights laws, to incorporate sexual orientation and gender identity, under the premise that a lot of the sorts of discrimination that this community faces is based on things like stereotypes or actions or presentations based on typical conceptions or mainstream conceptions of gender. And so in attempting to expand that, these cases try to build a wider definition. So we have a case out of Missouri called Walsh versus Friendship Village, in which a lesbian couple who had been married for about 7 years had decided that they wanted to move into what was an active elderly community. So they'd recognized that they were getting older. They were about in their 60s at the time. This particular community had no religious affiliation, did not meet any religious exemptions. They'd gone through an entire process of selecting the unit that they wanted, their appliances. They were ready to live their lives here. And right before signing the final papers, they received a call inquiring about the nature of their relationship. They had not been asked this before. And 2 days later, they receive a letter stating that it is the policy of Friendship Village not to allow unmarried people to reside or together, and that their definition of marriage included one man and one woman. And so they filed this lawsuit in a very conservative federal district court with a very conservative circuit court. And that sort of fought out for a while. So there were some good rulings actually within the court. Meanwhile, the Supreme Court was taking up a case called Basta versus Clayton County, which was similar, except it wasn't housing, it was in employment. There was a series of cases in which people were actually fired for their sexual orientation or gender identity. And the court ruled in that case that the definition of sex under federal law expanded to include as well sexual orientation and gender identity, at least in the employment context. So to further that along as well, the Biden administration issued executive order 13988, preventing and combating discrimination on the basis of gender identity and sexual orientation. So why that is important is because even though Virginia has its own law protecting sexual orientation and gender identity, what it now means is that if you are in a state or locality that doesn't have those protections and you feel like you've been discriminated in housing, you can file your complaint with the federal Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity Office at HUD, and they will interpret the law in that exact same way. So this is a really important moment, I think, for everyone involved in ensuring true equal access to housing.
Thank you, Alex, for all of that great news and additional background information. There were two things that you guys have mentioned so far that I wanted to kind of give our viewers some little background on. So one of them is testing, and what does that mean? How do we use it? And how people can be part of that system. And then the other is we keep talking about protections. And I think we talked a little bit about the fact that this is not the only one. But if we could outline what the other protections are, what are some of the biggest protections that we see issues with at home of VA? And if we can kind of answer those, I think that it would give a good baseline for bringing our guest on in just a moment.
Do you want to tackle protections and I can tackle testing, Heather?
Sure. So the Federal Fair Housing Act protects 7 classes of people, and Alex will explain to you why that's important and what that means. But it protects that you cannot be discriminated against because of your race, your color, your religion, your national origin, your sex, that you have a disability, or familial status, which means presence of children under the age of 18. And additionally, the Virginia Fair Housing Act covers those 7, but it also covers elderliness, which we've had for a long time. And then the 4 new protections that were added in 2020. And those are sexual orientation and gender identity, veteran status, and source of income. And if you're interested in source of income, that generally means that you have a housing choice voucher. We have another fair housing town hall available on our channels about that new protection, which is also very exciting. So Alex, why don't you talk about what being in a protected class means? You're muted.
Phrase of the last year and a half. So everyone fits or has one of these protected characteristics, right? We all have a race or a color or some sort of gender identity. And so what being protected means is that a housing provider cannot commit certain acts against you because of your race or because of your color, or now in Virginia, because of your sexual orientation, gender identity. These look like a refusal to rent based on you being in a same-sex relationship, providing different terms and conditions. So maybe charging you a higher rent because you're a member of one of these protected groups. So that's obviously a way of attempting to dissuade you or discourage you from renting there, setting different obstacles in your way because of your membership in a protected class. And then most obviously, discriminatory statements, which are always illegal. So if the housing provider is making statements to you about your gender, your gender identity, gender stereotypes, those are all red flags. Mary Beth had asked a question about testing. And I know oftentimes we're asked, how do you prove discrimination in the first place? A lot of times you might not even know that you're being discriminated against because the housing provider is misrepresenting availability to you. They might meet you with a smile and a handshake, and your interaction is completely polite and cordial, but at the end of it, they tell you that you have no units available. And then all of a sudden, someone who does not present with your same characteristics, so let's say a cisgendered person walks in after a transgendered person inquires about housing, and that's noticeable to the housing provider. Suddenly they have 3 units available when they told you that there were none available at all. If you have a singular experience, you might not actually know that discrimination occurred. That is why fair housing organizations like ours participate in testing, or it's akin kind of to secret shopping, but we're able to send 2 volunteers into the same housing provider to have a very similar interaction, right? They're just seeking housing, and we record those experiences because in comparing the experiences of two people with differing characteristics, we're able to actually show what the difference is and how those people are treated. And that provides us evidence and provides the people who call us evidence to actually enforce a fair housing claim. So it's really vital in making sure that we can protect the rights of everyone, because otherwise the evidence is hard to come by, and most average people don't have the resources to be able to conduct a comparative experience with the housing provider, or the time, right? Or you might not want to go relive through that traumatic experience either. So that's why we're here. And we will share a link if you are interested in volunteering as well. To be a tester with Home, we'll share a link so that you can sign up, and we'll let you know when the next training is.
Thank you both very much. At this point, we are going to welcome our guest on with us. It is Emily Sproul with the Shenandoah LGBTQ Center. Hello, Emily.
Good morning.
We were talking with you before we went live about why we're all here today, and I was hoping that you might be able to kind of restate what you said earlier, because I think you just put it so beautifully, why we exist and why HOMA VA partners with organizations like Shenandoah LGBTQ Center.
Absolutely. Yeah, our conversation earlier was about particularly the environment in rural communities. I know it sounds like a lot of your testing has happened in urban areas where there's a lot of housing units available. A lot of those are managed by property management companies. When you get into rural areas, you're getting more into private property owners who are renting their property. It's not a large company. You're also up against, in a small town especially, everybody knowing who you are. And so word gets around about a particular landlord, or word gets around about you as a tenant, and it can make situations really challenging, and it can make it hard for folks to get out of a difficult situation. And not only that, but I think that LGBTQ people, for the most part, are so accustomed to discrimination, especially older LGBTQ folks. They've grown up this way. They are used to being closeted, and they don't recognize that they actually do have power here to challenge a decision from a landlord or challenge the way that they are being treated. They're so used to just sucking it up and, dealing with it because they need the housing. So I'm super excited to be connecting with you all, and give our folks a voice and some leverage to secure the housing that they deserve.
Thank you for that perspective, Emily. I know that HOMA VA is based here in Richmond, Virginia, but our fair housing work is statewide. So it is important for us to remember that in a lot of areas in Virginia, it does not look like Richmond. We do have definitely a lot of different demographics and neighborhoods across the Commonwealth that all need representation. And HOME is hopefully here to make a difference in each of those communities. So for those of you that are watching right now, we are about to launch into our Q&A session. And Emily has brought some questions with her today, and we have some also additional questions from the LGBT Life Center in Hampton Roads. They're another partner of today's segment. So we are going to start launching into those, but if you have questions, please comment on whatever platform you're joining us on today. We're going to answer as many as possible. And then definitely check out our website. It's homeofva.org. There is a page dedicated to the topic of sexual orientation and gender identity in fair housing. We will be uploading as many questions as we can and the answers to them to that page after this session as well. So Emily, would you like to kick us off with a question?
Sure, I'd love to. Let's start with the basics. What are questions that a landlord can or cannot ask?
A great question. So landlords obviously have an interest in making sure that you are the person that you say you are and that you have the capacity to pay rent. and that you're not going to pose a threat to the tenants of that community or to the property of that community. So everything that they ask should really be in line with those things, and they shouldn't revolve around questions like who you are, as far as how you identify, whether that is based on your gender identity, or sexual orientation, or your race, or your disability for that matter, right? Those things all should apply equally. Even when they're asking about your family makeup, it really shouldn't be about a question about how many children are living in the home. It should be a question of how many people are going to be residing in the unit and which adults live there and are on the lease, right? Again, the interest is in finding that the people who say that they're living there and that are on the lease are in fact those people, but it shouldn't really go beyond that. So I like to start there.
Okay, follow-up question, if I might just slip in there. One of the biggest challenges for a lot of our trans folks is that they present as female, but their legal documents may not have been changed. That obviously creates some uncomfortable situations for folks. In that sort of situation, how does the landlord say, okay, you are who you say you are? What do trans people need to know about navigating that particular piece?
Yeah, so that is a really good question, Emily. And I might actually defer to you on that piece because I think that it probably applies to the same strategies that you use in every other scenario. And fortunately have never had that experience and don't know what that's like.
Well, I think so the only experience that I've had recently that's anything like this is that I took my trans daughter to the credit union to set up a checking account. She's underage, so I'm there to co-sign on the account. I introduced her to the bank employee as her chosen name, and then just slid the birth certificate across the counter and the social security card without saying anything, and just kind of hoping that everybody was going to be cool about this and nobody was going to make a big deal. And sure enough, it went beautifully. And her birth name was never mentioned in the entire interaction. And even the employee tried to went to check with their manager to see if it was possible to print her chosen name on her debit card, even without a legal name change. Unfortunately, it's not. But it was overall a very positive experience. But that's like playing Russian roulette. I mean, it's like you never know what you're going to get when you walk in. And to some extent, I think trans people have come to kind of expect that kind of challenge and that issue. And we do our best to make sure that we help them with name changes and obtaining documents that show that they are who they are. But it can be a long process. It can be an arduous process. And if you're looking for housing at the same time, it really does become difficult. Yeah.
So in that vein, I wish I had better strategies. These laws aren't necessarily going to prevent housing providers from acting out in discriminatory ways, but in having that interaction, there are a few things to keep in mind. If you have a witness there with you, if you're documenting what's happening, all of those things can provide evidence for a fair housing claim down the line if they act in a discriminatory way. I know that doesn't address the real question, and I think that there's going to be a lot of work there trying to knock down those walls just in those day-to-day interactions and help people understand the challenges that trans people might have with documentation, especially with identity documentation and how that reflects their identities. So it's work in progress.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we like to say a lot that the legal part is only a small part of changing the way that LGBTQ people are treated. So much of it has to do with hearts and minds and people understanding and being intentional about being inclusive. So, am I doing all the questions? You want me to jump in with another question?
Yeah,
keep going.
I'll keep rolling then. So what if I feel like the landlord is treating me unfairly? So I've been rented to, but I feel like the landlord is treating me unfairly because I'm gay and I'm a tenant. Are there questions that I can ask to try to find out if the landlord is discriminating against me without drawing his attention to it? Sort of goes back to that testing idea.
Yeah. So some strategies there is always documenting what's happening. I know, as you said, in a rural setting, it might be more difficult to make comparisons with neighbors, for example, about how you're being treated. But that might be something that you can do if you live in an apartment and suddenly the housing provider, finds out that your sexual orientation or gender identity doesn't align with their conception of what gender should be, right? So you can start to talk to your neighbors and get a sense of the comparison. It's much harder probably when you're renting from a single landlord. So start documenting your experiences. Virginia is a one-party consent state when it comes to recording, meaning that you only need the consent of one individual in a conversation in order to record. And so, and that individual consenting is the one recording. And so that can provide some evidence if you are in a really vulnerable situation, you don't have any witnesses, and you feel like the landlord is treating you differently because of your sexual orientation, gender identity, or if they're using discriminatory language especially. So those are some strategies on top of the testing work that we do. But we always recommend that you give us a call if you do feel like you're experiencing some of this, and we can talk about the personal, that specific set of facts as well.
Okay. It's good to know about recording conversations, because I know there are a lot of people who will push back against being recorded. And I think our LGBTQ community needs that reassurance that, yes, that is within their rights to do that.
It's really pivotal in ensuring the effectiveness of civil rights laws.
Absolutely. So how do you lodge a complaint? Who do you contact?
Yeah, so that is an opportunity to draw a distinction between us as Housing Opportunities Made Equal, a private fair housing nonprofit, versus the actual government entities that enforce the law. So, we receive money to advocate on behalf of people, grant funds to advocate on behalf of those who believe that they may be facing discrimination. We can help you sort out your claims, write a complaint, do testing, collect evidence, and help you lodge that complaint with the Virginia Fair Housing Office or with HUD, given the specific circumstances. So you can contact us first if you feel like you need specific help in the advocacy portion, in understanding your rights, in collecting evidence, in identifying big problems, because we have the power of bringing litigation as well to try and stop major housing providers from violating the law. And then we can also help you file that complaint through the administrative process to and help usher that. So there are a few avenues, but we're always open for the conversation. So definitely contact us.
Awesome.
So I'll throw something in there to that nature. If somebody feels like they do have a complaint to lodge, do they have to reach out as an individual to an organization like HOME, or can they go through an organization that they're already a part of, like the Shenandoah LGBTQ Center, to help work through the trauma that might be going on with the discrimination?
That is a really good point, because we are housing advocates and we know a lot about the legal process, but we're not clinicians or social workers, so we don't even always have access to all of the referral systems that our partners across the state might have. So I rely on that, especially when I'm speaking to people who call us, because they might need more resources than just understanding their fair housing rights.
I'll second that, because we, being in a relatively young nonprofit and being fairly new to the social work landscape, the silo effect is certainly evident everywhere you go. And there are steps being taken now through the Unite Virginia platform to connect all of these different service agencies as a clearinghouse. And that is helping us tremendously in working, as I say, as like a switchboard operator of, you know, come to us if you have a problem because you know us and you trust us, and we will connect you with whoever you need to be connected with in order to get the services that you require. And then we're here to just help case manage, help support you. And so it really does become a great team effort that way.
We're stronger together.
Oh my goodness, yes.
Yeah, I think the power of having an advocate, both for your individual housing problems, but also in the context and people who really understand the trauma and can be that support platform for you is really powerful.
Absolutely. So is there a time period that people have to report discrimination?
Great question. The law stipulates that if you're going to file an administrative complaint, so if you're going to file with the Virginia Fair Housing Office or HUD, you have a year from the last discriminatory action. So if it happened, if the last discriminatory act happened today, then you've got until April 27, 2022 to file that complaint with the Virginia Fair Housing Office, or 2 years if you're going to file federal litigation or file in the court. But yeah, that is a really good question. If the discrimination is ongoing, right, so there might be constant harassment, it could, that needle moves along with the continued harassment or discriminatory actions.
Okay, good to know.
So Alex, you just mentioned continued harassment, and this is something that Emily and I were talking about when we were prepping for this session, is what if you're being discriminated by somebody else in an apartment building or a neighbor, and not necessarily from your landlord? Are there any ways that, you know, these housing rights can help defend you?
A great question. Y'all are hitting pretty much every aspect of the Fair Housing Act today. The Fair Housing Act has a specific provision against harassment, coercion, intimidation, and retaliation. And that could be because you are exercising your fair housing rights, but also because you just fall into one of the protected classes. So let's say you file a complaint and your housing provider retaliates against you by sending you a termination notice. That is a violation of the law under that provision. But harassment under this kind of umbrella also includes, as you mentioned, harassment from a neighbor, or harassment from agents of the property management company. So maintenance workers, even contractors who are doing work on the property may be subject to the Fair Housing Act. So the way that this kind of works, harassment can be a criminal act under the Fair Housing Act, and the Department of Justice is typically, and the FBI are typically the enforcement arms for that criminal provision. But it also includes the civil provisions that the entirety of the Fair Housing Act claims. So let's say, for example, you're being harassed by a neighbor because of your sexual orientation, gender identity. You live next door to them. And every time you see them, they're making statements or they're blocking you in the hallway, et cetera, et cetera. There are steps that you should be taking, right, to try and mitigate this. One, if you're in danger, call 911. I mean, if you are in immediate danger, you need to protect. Or let me take that back. Don't only call 911. Do what you feel is safe. Whatever is going to be the safest option for you to ensure your safety, do that. So I apologize for that initial comment. Secondly, advising the property management company of the harassment from that neighbor. Once you do that, it is their responsibility to take action against that individual committing the harassing act. So they should be sending them a notice, trying to figure out what's going on, giving an eviction notice if it rises to that level. So, you know, the neighbor might be liable depending on the severity of the harassment. And then once you let the housing provider know, they are vicarious, they're liable if they do not act on the harassing or on the harassment. So that's how that kind of goes.
And I'll just add, in recent years, we have had successful sexual harassment cases that look just like what Alex is talking about, of a neighbor. And we were able to take action against the landlord for failing to do anything about it. So, you know, those are, you know, well-trod cases that would also then apply in the sexual orientation and gender identity space now that we have those protections.
That's so good.
Thank you, guys. And no pressure, Emily, but we have time for one more question. So
Great, because I have one more question.
perfect.
It's all coming together. So we talked a little bit about the difference in rural communities and the fact that we have fewer property management kinds of complexes and more private landlords. Are there landlords or property owners that are exempt from the fair housing protections?
Yes, there are.
Darn, not the answer I wanted.
I know. So there are a number of exemptions written into the law. Under most of the protections, so let me just make this caveat, there's a difference in the exemptions for source of income. So just set that aside. But for the rest of the protected classes, if a housing provider owns 3 or more rental properties,
Okay.
they are not exempt, or sorry, let's rephrase that. 3 or less, they are exempt from the act except from discriminatory statements. Unless they use a broker or agent. So so if Emily, let's say you own 2 houses, you live in one and you rent out the other, you are exempt from the law. So you could technically discriminate on the basis of any of those protected classes except for discriminatory statements. But if you used your local, let's say your local property management company, let's call it Shenandoah Realty, to list that home is no longer exempt from that.
Okay.
Right? Because you are using an agent. So smaller landlords, yeah, that's a real problem in rural Virginia. But there, because of the discriminatory statements provision, that seems to be the way to get at smaller landlords. And then if they use a discriminatory statement, they're still open to the other provisions, such as refusal to rent. You can file a complaint based on those actions.
Okay.
So I know we just said one more question, but I do want to dive into that a little bit more. Can you go over what a discriminatory statement exactly means so that people know maybe how to help themselves?
I mean, a housing provider really should not be using or saying anything about your race, color, religion, your family composition. They shouldn't be stating anything about your disability. So things to that effect. And I can give a few examples of some statements that might be a bit more subtle. So it could be simply asking about the nature of your children. Are your children quiet? Or making statements like, I hope your children are quiet. Making statements that might stereotype on the basis of any of those protected characteristics could be a red flag. So if they're starting to mention even just stereotypes about sexual orientation or gender identity, if they're questioning your appearance, those are all red flags to me. The way you're dressed even could be, especially in this context, could be a red flag.
Great. Thank you so much, Alex. And thank you, Heather, for being here with us, and Emily. Thank you and your organization for the wonderful things that you do for the people up in Shenandoah. And we are supporting you in other rural communities in these efforts. So please, if anybody does have even an inkling that you might be facing housing discrimination, reach out to us, reach out to your other resources, and we'll try to make this world a better place together. So thank you guys so much for joining us today for our last Fair Housing Town Hall. You can find all this information we were talking about today on the Home of VA.org website. There is a page dedicated to sexual orientation and gender identities. And like I said, we are going to try to type up and get onto the website questions from today's sessions for you guys to go back and use as a resource at a later date. So thank you guys all so much for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Mm-hmm.